Hi, my name is Evan O'Connor, and my apocalypse video project is focused on famine, starvation, and crop failures. So, what is a famine? Well, it may seem like a relatively straightforward concept. The definition for famine is not completely agreed upon. Well, it's easy to say famine equals mass starvation, and it's relatively simple to identify periods of mass starvation in the past as historical famines. When it comes to contemporary ongoing situations, the lines don't seem to be very clear. At what point do you classify a disaster as a famine? Is it at the point of inconsolable mass starvation? Or can we look to earlier signs and events that may indicate a society is approaching famine? The word famine, in the simplest form, is defined as an extreme and widespread scarcity of food. But in a modern context, the word famine refers to a specific crisis event that can be identified through different factors. Um, so the United Nations World Food Program considers a disaster to be a famine when there is widespread malnutrition and once a large amount of people have started starving to death from lack of sufficient foods. So on the IPC scale, which is a scale that measures food security and other factors contributing to starvation, a famine is the highest classification of food insecurity. Phase 5, famine / humanitarian catastrophe. The IPC scale defines the factors of a famine as when at least 20% of households in an area face extreme food shortages with a limited ability to cope. The prevalence of malnutrition in children exceeds 30%, and the death rate is higher than 2 people per 10,000 a day. So we know how we identify famines, but what causes a famine in the first place? The ultimate cause of famine is a food shortage. But what are some causes of food shortages? The ones that come to mind for most people are things like crop failures, natural disasters, and overpopulation. However, there are many other causes that influence this as well. In occurrences like crop failures, there are many smaller factors that influence the crop failure in the first place also. Many of these causes have a sort of domino effect, so often multiple of these causes will be present in a famine. Here I'll elaborate on some specific causes of famine. So crop failure is probably the most seen sign of a famine. No matter the original cause, most historical famines coincide with a crop failure as well. Just one widespread crop failure season could spell disaster for an entire population, and often is hard to mitigate. The traditional idea of a crop failure is usually thought to be caused by a drought, and while droughts do often cause these failures, most of the variables in crop failure are decided by the soil type and climate of the region. Those with higher soil salinities or more unstable climates are always given a higher risk for crop failure. One very topical cause is infestation, given worldwide attention due to the ongoing massive locust infestation and subsequent crop failures occurring in northeastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Pest infestations are somewhat common, but when they occur on a massive scale, like we're seeing in the Horn of Africa right now, can threaten the food security of millions of people. Crop failures bring along with them the likelihood of mass emigration from the area experiencing the crop failure, huge influxes from rural farming areas into cities, and a lot of times societal unrest followed by lower class or farmer revolts. So natural disasters are another big cause. When a natural disaster occurs, it can massively disrupt the supply chain of a country or isolate large populations from food supplies. It also causes crop failures, all contributors towards famine. Droughts are one of the main causes of crop failures and can cause water shortages as well and livestock mortalities. Earthquakes can topple infrastructure and block roads, leading to supply chain issues and isolated populations unable to access food. A prime example of this is seen in the 2010 Haiti earthquake. Alongside that, earthquakes can trigger tsunamis, which in turn causes flooding, something detrimental to both the food supply and the supply chain. Wildfires can be extremely detrimental to the food supply as well, especially grain supplies and grain fields. Extremely cold conditions that can be caused by blizzards also are detrimental to the growth of crops, and the large amount of snow can damage the supply chain. So severe climatic events. There are periods of times where Earth experiences massive rapid changes in its global climate. like rapid global warming or cooling, extreme aridification, and sea level changes. Some of the most well known of these events within the last 10,000 years include the Little Ice Age of 1500, the 4.2 kiloyear event, and the 8.2 kiloyear event. The root causes of these events are a little hard to establish, but some of the most plausible include atmospheric disturbances, solar phenomena, northern ice resting events. These are known as bond events, and other climatic oscillations. These events almost always cause a famine on some scale, as the intense climatic change will throw most crop patterns off, as well as have a bunch of other effects on human ability to get food. So anthropogenic causes. In some cases, the root cause of a famine can be due to human activities instead of natural causes. The best example for an anthropogenically caused famine is the Great Chinese Famine, the deadliest famine in recorded history. I'll talk more about that in the next slide. Human causes of famine are usually governmental in nature, things such as supply chain malfunctions, ethnic persecution, trade policies, sanctions, colonialism, and war. Famines are heavily associated with colonial and autocratic governmental systems and are rarely seen in recent functioning democratic societies. The main reason for this is that in systems like these, there's almost no influence on the government by the general populace, leading to massive government mistreatment of the working class. Colonial possessions historically have had a huge number of famines stemming from distrust and unwillingness to help the natives of the area by the colonizing European powers, sometimes purposely inflicting famines on the natives. The term state-sponsored famine refers to famines that have been caused directly by governmental policies. These famines are usually, but not always, deliberately implemented by the government in order to accomplish a goal or commit ethnic or class-based cleansing. So in the next few slides, I'll go through some of the most notable historical famines. So first off, the Great Chinese Famine. China has a history of major famines. 6 out of 10 of the deadliest famines in recorded history have taken place in China, as well as a large amount of smaller localized famines across areas in China. The 1958 Great Chinese Famine is both China's most recent large famine, as well as the deadliest and most devastating famine in global recorded history. There were multiple root causes for the massive famine, but most of them seemed to be caused by the new policies implemented by the PRC's Great Leap Forward initiative. The Great Leap Forward is a massive and drastic shift in farming policy and prohibited private ownership of farmland. The farmland of China was split into people's communes, and all cultivation would be redistributed by the government with production quotas for each commune. The output of these communes was often appropriated by the government and not redistributed equally, setting the stage for a major famine. Another problem was due to the size of China and the relative remoteness of most farming areas. The redistribution of these food supplies would often be extremely slow, and many times not reach certain areas for months on end. Dubious agricultural techniques were also used to maximize crop output, namely close planting and deep plowing. And while this would maximize food output in a few growing seasons, it would effectively destroy croplands after about 2 or 3 seasons, being unable to yield crops sufficiently afterwards. The attempted sparrow extermination, as well as other pest extermination campaigns, negatively affected crop dispersal and biodiversity, which influenced famine. This is a famine where it's easy to definitively blame human activities for the majority of the fault. And even though during the famine, the government maintained that natural disasters were the sole cause of the famine, many of the governmental officials of the time have since admitted to massive government oversights. In 1981, the Chinese Communist Party attributed the famine to mistakes during the Great Leap Forward, as well as the anti-rightist campaign and the Sino-Soviet split. Up to 55 million Chinese citizens died from starvation during this period, making this the absolute worst famine in human history. Ethiopia, like many African nations, has had a long and storied past with major famines, many of them occurring in very recent years. The first really well-documented famine to strike Ethiopia was the 1890s African rinderpest epizootic, which the rinderpest virus killed up to 90% of the cattle, sheep, and goats in eastern Africa, especially Ethiopia. The sudden livestock death event triggered a massive famine in Ethiopia, which ended up with a third of Ethiopia's human population starving to death. Since that, famines have consistently struck Ethiopia with 8 major famines since 1900. The most recent famine, caused by the Tigray Civil War in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, currently is still ongoing, with the death count increasing every day. So, indigenous Amerindian famines, Native American colonization, basically. European colonization of the Americas was brutally devastating for the indigenous population. Many native populations were slaughtered or killed by European diseases, leaving the farmlands in much of the Americas to become unsuitable or unsustainable also and collapse. This farmland collapse is actually theorized to be one of the contributors for the period of global cooling in the early 1500s, known as the Little Ice Age. European colonization of the Americas killed 10% of the global human population just between the years of 1495 and 1525. One of the most devastating factors in the destruction of Native American populations was the attempted total extermination of the buffalo from the American plains. European settlers attempted a mass culling of buffalo populations in the late 1700s to late 1800s, both to make room for their cattle populations and destroy the food supply of the native population. Some specific examples of indigenous American famines include the 1760 Brazil drought, the destruction of the Sharkhead Band in Ontario, and the Bering Sea famine on St. Lawrence Island in Alaska. So the Holodomor, or the Ukrainian genocide, was the intentional starvation of the Ukrainian populace by Stalin-led Soviet government. At least 5 million Ukrainians died from starvation. It centered around punishment for the Ukrainian people for wanting independence and being seen as anti-Soviet, but it was also around the switch from privatized to public farmland and making it people-owned and government-owned farmland, which the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian farmers were very against because Ukraine has always been Europe's breadbasket. And in that way, it's very similar to the Chinese famine, except this was very, very intentional by Stalin to punish the Ukrainian public. So now I'm going to talk about the 4.2 kiloyear event and some less traditional types of famines. So the 4.2 kiloyear event was a severe climactic event, and it's a period of intense climactic activities occurring throughout the 22nd BC century. This period included severe aridification in neotropical areas and intense flooding in subpolar areas. The exact cause of this event is very hard to determine, but it's very likely due to a multitude of factors, and 2 of the leading theories are that this was either caused by a bond event, which is basically large North Atlantic ice rafting events, or an exceptional asteroid impact, or both. The extreme aridity of this time period caused massive desertification and sent humanity into a worldwide famine. This extreme desertification and famine is thought to be the root cause of the Middle Bronze Age collapse, including the downfall of the old Egyptian kingdom, the Akkadian Empire, and the Liangzhu dynasty. Despite how long ago this occurred, this is thought to be the most recent truly worldwide famine, seemingly affecting every single contemporary civilization with starvation and excess mortality. So an ice famine is a type of famine that we don't really see happen much anymore. An ice famine was a shortage of ice on the market in any particular area. Ice famines used to be really common occurrence during summer months before refrigeration became common. The shortage of ice can cause widespread food spoilage and also can cause a higher rate of dehydration and heat stroke during the summer months. Lack of refrigerated food can also lead to diseases and bacteria to manifest in food supplies, sometimes leading to outbreaks. This is a type of famine that we have almost completely eradicated. Thanks to the advent of refrigeration, most people today have easy access to ice year-round. So I just talked about a type of famine that only affected us in the past. Here's a new type of famine that may affect us in the future. Nuclear famine is a theoretical type of famine that, while not actually occurring anywhere as of yet, is considered to be a significant risk to humanity if any sort of nuclear warfare takes place in the future. The IPPNW has declared that a nuclear exchange with as few as 100 nuclear weapons, that's only 0.5% of the world's nuclear weapon supply, could disrupt the global climate so heavily that it would most likely send humanity into a worldwide famine. Obviously, if humanity ever enters into a true nuclear war, there would be mass destruction and devastation worldwide, not just in the areas hit directly under the nuclear impact. One of these factors causing destruction is known as nuclear winter and would have a huge effect on food production, causing a worldwide crop failure. This type of famine seemed like a much more plausible threat during the height of the Cold War, but even now it's considered a concerning possibility, one we hopefully won't see take place in our lifetimes. So we've seen how badly famines can affect populations, but what are we doing to stop them? And what are we doing to help those currently facing famine? So first, some good news. There are fewer underfed people today than there have been at any point in history. According to Action Against Hunger, only 9.2% of the global population is currently facing severe food insecurity. This is a drop from 13.5% in 2000 and a huge drop from 24.4% in 1989. This shows just how much progress we have made in combating famine in a modern context. A good amount of credit is due to organizations that combat famine. In recent years, they've made a huge difference in impoverished and famine-stricken areas, decreasing the rates of food insecurity. Some of the most well-known of these organizations include names like Action Against Hunger, Famine Early Warning System, and Food First, United Nations World Food Program, and Concern Worldwide. The appearance of famine relief has rapidly changed throughout the last few decades, and its current form looks different depending on the specific circumstances of the famine. Recently, in areas not affected by an actual food shortage, but more so the general populace's lack of being able to afford food, relief groups have been distributing money and vouchers instead of actual foodstuffs, and this makes sustainability of the relief effort much more manageable. Relief technologies such as vaccinations, better public health systems, better systems for rationing food, and programs specifically for food insecure children has been a great asset in aiding the temporary mitigation of famines. While economic impacts are still devastating, we as a global society are coming much closer to eliminating famine as a threat completely. Thank you for watching. Here are my citations. I hope you learned something.